The county recorder's office closes at 4:30 on Fridays, and Marcus Reyes found that out the hard way. Standing at the counter at 4:47, holding a property survey that shouldn't have existed, watching a clerk flip the deadbolt from the inside without making eye contact. He had driven there straight from work, still in his contractor's boots, because 3 hours earlier his neighbor Diane Holbrook had handed him a laminated notice. Laminated, as if she'd been planning this for a while, informing him that his back fence was encroaching 14 feet onto what she was now claiming as her lot extension, approved and recorded, she said, by the HOA and the county. That was a Thursday in October. By the following Monday, Marcus had taken 4 days of unpaid leave, hired a real estate attorney, and started a file folder he would eventually label simply Diane. What's interesting about that moment? A man standing outside a locked government office holding a document that may have been forged, is that it almost didn't happen at all. If Marcus had been the kind of person who shrugged things off, Diane might have gotten exactly what she wanted. Quick note before we begin. This is a fictional, dramatized story for education and entertainment. Any resemblance to real people is coincidental. This story is inspired by common HOA situations people talk about online. All names and details here are fictional. Marcus and Elena Reyes had owned their home in the Pinecrest Commons subdivision for 11 years. They'd built the back fence themselves the summer their youngest started walking. Pressure-treated pine, 4 feet high, running exactly along the property line they'd confirmed with the original survey when they bought. Diane Holbrook had moved in next door 7 years later, and for the first 2 years, things were fine. Polite waves. Occasional small talk over the fence about the weather or the HOA's latest newsletter. Then Diane ran for the HOA Architectural Committee, won by 3 votes, and something shifted. Small things at first. A notice about Marcus's rain gutters being the wrong shade of beige, a complaint that his driveway basketball hoop was 2 inches too tall. Marcus responded to each one in writing, kept copies, fixed what needed fixing. His flaw, if you could call it that, was that he documented compulsively. Every email, every notice, every response, timestamped and filed. Elena used to tease him about the binders. By year 3 of Diane's committee tenure, the notices had stopped. Marcus assumed she'd moved on. He hadn't considered that she might have just changed strategies. The laminated notice Diane handed him that October Thursday cited an HOA amendment, Amendment 14C, boundary clarification provision, that Marcus had never seen in any of the governing documents he'd been given at closing. It claimed the HOA had the authority to reclassify up to 15 feet of any property's rear boundary as common easement under specific conditions, and that a county survey filed 6 weeks prior had formalized Diane's adjacent lot claim. Marcus read it twice in his driveway before going inside and opening his binders. Amendment 14C did not exist in any version of the CC&R documents he had. Under standard HOA law, amendments to governing documents, particularly those affecting property boundaries, require a formal vote of the membership, proper notice to all homeowners, and in most states, filing with the county recorder's office with original signatures. A unilateral amendment produced by a committee member, with no membership vote and no notice, has no legal standing regardless of what it says on the paper. What Marcus was holding, though he didn't know the legal term yet, was potentially a fraudulently created document being used to assert a property claim, which in most states constitutes both civil fraud and criminal forgery. Frank Oduya, the real estate attorney Marcus found through a referral from his contractors union, looked at the laminated notice for approximately 45 seconds before setting it down on his desk and removing his glasses. He told Marcus 3 things. First, that this document appeared to have been generated using the HOA's letterhead without board authorization. Second, that the county survey it referenced did exist, but had been filed under Diane's name alone, not the HOA's. And third, and this was the part that made Marcus go very still, that the survey had been signed by a licensed surveyor whose license number, when Frank looked it up that evening, belonged to Diane's brother-in-law. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. If you're finding value in this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you've ever experienced a similar HOA or neighborhood situation, feel free to share your story in the comments. The next 4 months were not dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no screaming match in the driveway, No confrontation at an HOA meeting. Marcus had learned early that Diane performed best when she had an audience and a provocation. Instead, he went quiet. He filed a formal dispute with the HOA board through certified mail, attaching his original property survey, his closing documents, and a written legal analysis from Frank outlining the deficiencies of Amendment 14C. He filed a complaint with the State Surveyor Licensing Board about the brother-in-law. He submitted a records request to the county recorder for all documents filed against his parcel in the last 3 years. What came back from that records request was the second shock. Someone, the request couldn't tell him who, had submitted a boundary modification application to the county 8 months earlier, before the laminated notice, before any of this became visible to Marcus. The application had been rejected by the county for insufficient documentation, but it established a clear timeline. Diane had been attempting this for nearly a year before she handed him that notice. She had tried the county first, been rejected, and then apparently decided to fabricate the HOA amendment and try again. This is the part of the story worth sitting with, because what Diane did wrong, beyond the obvious legal exposure, was assume that Marcus would see a laminated official-looking document and simply comply. The assumption behind document fraud is almost always the same, that the target doesn't know their rights, doesn't have their paperwork and won't fight back. Every one of those assumptions was wrong. The HOA board, when presented with Frank's legal analysis, voted unanimously to disavow Amendment 14C and formally notify the county that the document had not been authorized. Carl Stitch, the board president, called Marcus personally, a call Marcus recorded, because of course he did, to apologize and confirm in writing that the HOA had no claim on his property. The state licensing board suspended Diane's brother-in-law's surveying license pending investigation. Diane herself faced a civil suit from Marcus for fraud and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She settled out of court for an amount her attorney negotiated down, but not to zero. She moved out of Pinecrest Commons 11 months after handing Marcus that laminated notice. The fence is still there, exactly where it always was. The thing about document fraud in an HOA context is that most people don't realize it's happening until they're already 2 steps behind. And by the time they understand what they're looking at, the psychological damage. A feeling like the ground has shifted under your home is already done. That's why knowing what an HOA amendment actually requires, what makes a survey legally valid, and what your rights are when someone files against your parcel, that knowledge is not optional. It's the difference between Marcus's outcome and what Diane was counting on. If you want to understand your rights before something like this lands on your doorstep, this channel is exactly where you need to be. Subscribe and hit the bell. We cover these stories every week and we never waste your time. If this episode gave you something to think about, a like costs you nothing and helps us reach the next homeowner who needs to hear it. See you in the next story.